안녕하십니까. 한국경제신문 뉴욕 특파원 박신영입니다. 저는 지금 뉴저지 프린스턴 대학 인근에 앵거스디턴 프린스턴 대학교 명예교수님의 댁으로 와 있습니다. 앵거스디턴 교수님은 2015년에 노벨경제학상을 받으셨고 그 이후에도 또 그 전에도 굉장히 왕성한 저서 활동을 통해서 한국에 있는 독자들에게도 굉장히 널리 알려져 있는 분이십니다. 귀하게 인터뷰를 할 수 있게 돼서 저희도 너무 기쁘고 지금부터 이제 인터뷰를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. How about start with last night presidential debate? How did you find it?
I was encouraged, like most Americans. We don't know Kamala Harris very well, and I thought she was very poised and stood up very well to the bullying, angry man on the other side of the debate.
She really provoked Trump, I think.
She certainly did, and he couldn't stop himself being provoked,
Right.
which is, he doesn't have a lot of self-control in that department.
Your book is released in Korea and name is Good Economic and Bad Economics. How could you define what is good economy?
Well, it's a little hard because, my definition might be different from someone else's. But I wanted to make the impression that economists actually know a lot. And, we've learned a lot over the subject's existence for 150 years, maybe 200 years. But I think in recent years, we've applied it very selectively and that we've made a lot of mistakes by using some parts of economics and ignoring other parts. My old friend Tony Atkinson, who's no longer with us, used to say that what is really important is that the economy should serve people and not people serve the economy. And I think a lot of policy making over the past 30 or 40 years has been about the economy. People have to be subservient to the economy instead of the economy doing things for people.
I think you have already answered, but what is the biggest mistake in economics history?
I don't want to go back in the whole of history. I mean, we're not going to talk about the Irish potato famine or something like that. I think in recent years, the financial crisis certainly changed the minds of a lot of us. And there was this, I think, overly strong belief that markets could do just about anything and that we should leave markets alone and not mess with them. And that if some people got very rich, that was okay because in the end that would help everybody else. This is a trickle down, as it were. And I think after the financial crisis, it's really hard to believe in trickle down anymore because the people who caused the crisis got really, really rich and enormous numbers of people were hurt by it who were never compensated for that. So I think that's been part of it. The other part, for me at least, has just been the work that Anne and I have done, and Case and I, on looking at what we call deaths of despair. So even though the economy might be doing okay recently, there's still an enormous number of people dying from drug overdoses, from suicides, from alcoholism, and things that are not really happening in nearly all other countries around the world. So we may be doing well in money terms, but we're not doing very well in life. And life is very important. If you're dead, money is not worth very much.
Was there any strong motivation you start to interest in kind of that?
Well, I've always had an interest in demography. And so I've always been a sort of amateur in thinking about these things. The most recent work we really came across by accident, and then putting it all together and sort of you've got this financial crisis at the same time all these people are dying, so that people in America who don't have a 4-year college degree are living shorter lives every year, which is not happening to the people who have a college degree. And only a third of people in America have a college degree. So this economy is not serving people very well. And there's a lot of very angry people who are represented by a very angry man on television last night. And so you can see why some of that motivation is coming from.
But these days, someone said they are helpful to control inflation because of their low wage.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think inflation has to do with many other things, like controlling the money supply and so on. So I don't think we can cure inflation on the back of poor people by saying you have to be paid even less. So that's a complicated question, but I don't think it's true that paying poor people more. I mean, if you look at the period, the 30 years after the war, there was a lot of common prosperity and a lot of people getting rich or richer together. And there was almost no inflation during that period. So that can be done.
The pandemic is crisis, yeah. U.S. government had a very aggressive fiscal policy. It was very helpful to boom up the economy, but it caused a side effect like inflation. So how could you evaluate the government policy?
It's hard to put yourself back in that situation. You know, Korea had a very aggressive policy from the very beginning, and not that many people died there as a share of the population, whereas here people were very, very frightened. And here in New Jersey, they were building emergency morgues to store bodies in. So, you know, it was pretty bad. People were very scared, and there was really concern that the economy would shut down altogether. And so you had to take strong fiscal measures to try to prevent that. Those measures were voted by almost unanimously by the political parties. So, you know, this was not Democrats versus Republicans. This was just about everybody spending that money. Other countries did similar things, maybe not quite on the same scale, but similar things. And as to inflation, there's no doubt that some of the spending, the fiscal response by the Biden administration at the very end may have, in retrospect, looked like it was too generous. But I don't think the fiscal posture of the U.S. government is a major contributor to inflation. I mean, the inflation was to do with supply chains breaking down. You know, you couldn't get anything. The ships couldn't discharge. You couldn't get motor cars. There were years' waits for, not years' waits, but months and months' waits for
They
things.
couldn't expect the war or something.
Right, and if you look at the inflation was similar in Europe. The U.S. was not sending checks to Europeans.
Yeah, right.
Certainly not. So, you know, you have some other explanation for it. And this happened to a lot of countries, and it's I think, much more to do with the fragmenting of supply chains during the pandemic.
I know this is a very stupid question, but I really like to ask you, did you expect the inflation when pandemic began?
I think we were focused on other things like people dying, and I'm not someone that thinks a lot about inflation. That's not the sort of economics I do. But I was not surprised by it, and the lack of surprise, I mean, it just seemed fairly obvious that if you can't import gas, or you can't import cars, or you can't import a lot of stuff that we import, then its prices are going to go up.
In your book, you refer the increasing the minimum wage does not affect negatively to employment.
I wouldn't put it quite as unqualifiedly as you put it, meaning that I think if you made the minimum wage $60 an hour, it would certainly have an effect on employment. But the sort of things we're talking about, between $7.25 an hour is now up to, say, $15. I don't think these would have. And I think there's pretty much wide acceptance. I mean, Britain has had a minimum wage since the days when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. And it's been studied by people on the right, people on the left, people all over the place. And I don't think anyone has come up with a good case that it's reduced in employment.
Do you differentiate between labor and union?
Yes. Well, not all labor are in unions, for one thing. And in fact, in the private sector in America today, only 6% of working people are in unions. It's much higher in the public sector. America would be a better place if private sector unions were more widespread and more powerful.
In Korea, for example, one certain company has to get permission if they want to new factory abroad. A lot of companies try to leave our country because of high wages. I think the U.S., there is the same thing happened, like a Rust Belt.
Yes, but I don't think you can blame the Rust Belt on high wages. If you look at what's happened to wages throughout the whole period when the motor industry was falling apart, those wages were going down through that period. Maybe they should have gone even faster. But, you know, a lot of it had to do with exchange rates, with the U.S. running a huge deficit, tax cuts that made no sense. And I don't think people fully agree on all of what handled that, but there was a very overvalued dollar exchange rate, which made it very difficult for exporters to export and very easy for importers to import. And I think that had a lot to do with the creation of the Rust Belt too. So I wouldn't put the blame on unions. I think the unions have done badly because they've done badly. So, if they're not very good at increasing wages and working conditions for their people, then people don't see why they should join unions.
You said in your book, economics has to return to the philosophy. What kind of philosophy economists should focus on?
Well, I think they could focus on different strands in philosophy. I'm not laying down a particular philosophy that people should believe in. When I was a student and starting out in Cambridge in England, way back in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of debate with philosophers and economists. Amartya Sen was there at that time. I remember we sat around and discussed Rawls's new book, The Theory of Justice, which had just come out. We used to have a subject called welfare economics, which was studying the well-being of people, and that is not taught anymore in any American graduate program, for instance. So students and professional economists really don't know anything about it. They have a sort of half understanding of utilitarianism, but there are other things out there and they don't know about them, and I think they take this very narrow view of human well-being, which is to do with it's how much you spend, and that's a terrible way of thinking about things, and none of the major philosophies would endorse that as an objective.
What is the most important thing you want to deliver through this book?
Well, I think health is a big part of it. Because the minute you start thinking about what matters to people, then money might be important, but so is health. And then the other thing that's not often talked about, but is incredibly important to people, is family and relationships with other people. So one of the things that happens when people lose their jobs, especially if you close down a town as an effective unit, is they lose a lot of relationships with people. There's this phrase that Rawls used called the social basis of self-respect. So if you want to respect yourself as a human being, you have to be related to other people. You have to matter in your community. And these things are really, really important. And economists just blow all that away, I think. They'll say, yeah, sure, but they never do anything about it. And when they're looking at trade deals and so on, all they're doing is adding up benefits and costs in money terms and not bothering about the rest of stuff.
In Korea, during the pandemic period, people started to be interested in U.S. stock market. Increasingly, they are start to more interesting about U.S. stock market, and then they are start to be interested in U.S. politics. Which president gonna be a good leader for global foreign policy?
You're talking about the stock market. A lot of people seem to think that if the stock market goes up, that shows there's a good economy. That is awful, complete nonsense. Right? It's good for people who own stock. Most Americans don't own any stock.
We usually think stock market equals economy situation.
Well, that's ridiculous. Let me give you an example. Let's say a big airline finds some way of firing half of its staff or reducing its wages by 50%. Stock market immediately goes up. What about the people who just lost their jobs? This is terrible. What the stock market is the valuation of capital. So the stock market does not respond to the value of labor at all.
U.S. stock market has jumped up, very huge jump. Do you think it can represent U.S. economy these days?
No, that huge jump is mostly driven by artificial intelligence. And during the pandemic, it was mostly driven by the upward reevaluation of high tech, because people didn't watch Netflix all the time before the pandemic, and now they do watch Netflix all the time or whatever, right? So that made Netflix a much more valuable company. But that's what it's about. It's not about human well-being, let alone the things I was talking about, the relationships and people's lives and how they get on.
So do you think there is some bubble these days in U.S. market?
I'm not an expert on that. The economists have been fighting over whether bubbles can exist forever.
But you say we have to be careful.
Well, it's just that the stock market is very good if you own stocks, right? And if you're a capitalist and own capital, the stock market tells you what that's worth, and everybody likes to be rich, and no one likes to be poor. But it's irrelevant for the vast majority of Americans.
Very silly question and wise answer. Thank you. So how about which president can be a very good global policy leader, foreign policy leader?
Well, if we're talking about Trump versus Harris, you might have your doubts about Harris and about her experience in foreign policy, but Trump is not someone you'd want to put in charge of anything. The one thing that I think is really genuine about him is he doesn't like these endless foreign wars, and I agree with that. I think it's been too easy.
Do you have or do you want to say something to Asian readers, including Korean people?
Beware of the economists.
지금까지 앵거스디턴 교수님의 댁에서 인터뷰를 진행했습니다. 감사합니다.